Yeah, up to snuff, you know how it is. So yeah. And what do I research? Okay, so I spend a lot of my time researching across criminal justice. And I tend to be somebody, I'm not one of these career academics, I'm afraid, who's got it all strategically worked out. I just thought, ooh, that's interesting. And I talk to people, the most
Best kind.
yeah, the most fascinating things I find I come across is when I'm out there in the real world. Because academia very often doesn't feel like the real world, it's kind of like a microcosm. And so I get my sort of, if you like, my esteem from outside of the university where I'm treated like an expert. And so I went into, I think I was telling you last time, Claire, I went into Doncaster, or Doncatraz as we call it, locally. And I cried all the way home, James, and swore I'd never.
Well, look, I should say I'm from Scunthorpe, so I can understand you crying when you go to Doncaster, but that's entirely a local rivalry thing.
Sorry, yeah. So, I said I'd never do it again, but it was so fascinating because you feel like you're getting a window into a world that you just think, what is this about? It's so different. It's a whole different set of rules, languages, and kind of, so you feel a bit like an anthropologist. And so, yes, and then I suppose I'm just very interested in other people's lives, and the fact that their lives aren't like mine, I don't find that difficult or a threat. I just want to see the world through other people's eyes, because how can you understand experiences? So obviously I'm a qualitative researcher and I spend a lot of time talking to people, and it's really interesting in prisons. I remember I interviewed back to back about 12 prisoners one day, because it's a very limited day in prison, you get thrown out and that's that. And I'd interviewed about 8 to 12 people, and I was just like, blah, 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 blah. And the prison officer said to me, well, I like your job. All you get to do is talk to people all day. It's so different when you're trying to turn. So I know I've done a great job, and it'd be the same for you. When people have said to me, are you going to start interviewing me yet? And I'm like, damn, I'm good. You haven't even known, you know, because it is really a structured conversation. So I'm always thinking, what's coming next? Should I probe what's being said? I don't quite understand that, you know, that kind of thing. So yes, anyway, that's a very long-winded way of saying what I do, but I'm just very curious, and I find people in the criminal justice system fascinating in the sense that I just want to help, because life's hard enough without that added complication, which generally tends to make things even tougher. So I think that's what I do.
Yeah, I know Claire, again, has got thousands of questions for you. Let me just start with one, and let me be topical here for a moment. Everything we read about at the moment about the criminal justice system in the UK, at least, it appears to me on the face of it bad news, right? We hear about massive overcrowding, we hear about prisoner releases, and so on and so on and so on. Is it as bad as we read?
Well, there are a lot of prisons out there, and all I can say, having just completed an analysis of 119 prison inspection reports, so it's relatively coherent. Well, some of them are 5 years old, but there are some prisons that are better than others. But the fact is, you look at any public institution, the NHS, the higher education sector, you know, it's all under pressure, because we've been in this, what do they call it, austerity for so long now, and we've got cost of living crisis. It's, you know, is it more for less or less for more? Anyway, whichever way round, it's not good across the board, is it? But I suppose what I find difficult is that, yes, things are not great. We've got staffing crises, we've got cohorts of young officers that are coming in, and it's great because they're more diverse than they were before, but some of them are a little bit afraid, and the prisoners can smell it a mile off, as you can imagine. But, you know, they'll get there, and that's why you need this kind of, because we were, you know, peer mentoring is what I've most recently done in prison, but that's the same for staff, because, and I suppose if you were going to ask me what my approach was, I'm a sociologist by trade. I did a sociology degree and a PhD, and I've come into criminology, and there are many parallels and similarities. But I suppose my argument is that you should start with a sort of like a community first approach. You know, you find out who you're working with, And then it's about negotiating. And that's what annoys me about prisons. The staff are members of that community. They happen to not live there, but they work there. They spend an awful lot of time there. So it's that kind of, I think that's where I jump into it. So to answer your question, James, sorry, going off topic yet again, I would say that there is some amazing work that goes on day to day in prisons. Fantastic. There are staff and prisoners who go above and beyond every day of the week, because you are throwing a load of people who are frightened and alone. They've been cut off. Some of them don't even know they're going to prison. They're distressed. I mean, you know about the proportions of people in prison who have come from care. So they've already got sort of, problematic relationship formation already. The mental health needs, neurodiversity, they're all there. There's a report, it's a few years old now, it's called the Balancing Act report. And I read it, and I thought things were difficult. My chin hit the floor because I was amazed. And actually, you can look back at some of the theorists that took, prisons, the rich get richer and, the poor get prison. You go into prison and you will see that should these people be in prison or should they be in hospitals or therapeutic centres? But it's coming through because, we're starting to realise that therapeutic communities really do work. And I've seen, and it's now being modelled in the prisons. So it's a work in progress, I think is fair to say, James. But I can see
it's so interesting that. Well, it's so interesting because last week we spoke to Dr. Stephen Heron, who I know you know, and he spoke very clearly, I thought, about radicalisation and about how the way to tackle that is about having institutions and about having those communities. You're talking about the same thing about prison and prisoners and about developing communities, but I know Claire's got loads of things to ask you. So why don't you start?
Yeah, I think, picking up on that thread, over the course of this podcast, I think one of the things that's really strongly come out as we've been looking at the attention economy and some of the problems that plague it is a really big problem is one, isolation, and interconnected to it, to uncertainty. Are people able to respond to uncertainty? How do they deal with that? And especially when they do feel isolated. And prison seems to be almost the pressure cooker of those two problems, right? No matter what time of, what era we live in, if you're going into a prison, you don't know what to expect. You don't know anyone there likely, or if you might do, but that causes its own issues. And you're ultimately very isolated, both, if you're a staff, you feel isolated from the people you're trying to, you feel isolated from the people who are incarcerated. If you're in prison, if you've been sent to prison, you feel isolated from everyone around you, your family, and from the staff as well. Your work with peer mentoring, how did that come about? And can you describe some of the differences that it makes compared to other approaches?
Theoretically, there are all sorts of benefits. It's been shown that having people that are engaged with you and care about whether you come out your cell every day, pop their heads around.
I'm sorry, first I should ask, what's a peer mentor?
Oh, right, what's a peer mentor? Well, that's my dear.
Go back to the beginning.
I'd love to tell you, but that's up for debate. But my definition of peer mentor, is somebody who is going through the same thing as you are at the same time. So the fact is that if you have somebody, one of your neighbours is having a baby and you're pregnant about the same time, that would be a peer. But having somebody who's had a baby, but the baby's a year old or 10 years old or 25 years old, they're still on that spectrum, but they've lived through it and they've survived. Whereas when you're pregnant, it's your first baby, you don't really know what the hell's going on or what to expect. So again, it links into your thing about anxiety levels, because you've not experienced it before. So a peer mentor, I would say it's that synchronicity. It's a big word, but it means just together. So you're experiencing the same thing. So you can talk about, well, they told me this. Oh, don't worry, I heard that, but they also added that. So you can reassure one another, and it's like two heads are better than one to negotiate.
Yeah, it's perspective.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And having somebody to kind of talk through, well, I heard them say this. Oh no, you missed that bit. I still do that with my peers at work. I didn't hear her tell us we've got to do that this year, this kind of thing. So that's what I would call a peer mentor. Now, I know there are lots of jobs and titles which involve the word peer mentor, but sadly, I've had a bit of pushback, I think it's fair to say, because of course you've got lived experience. These are people who are no longer subject to the sort of mandated criminal justice restrictions, i.e. they're not in prison or on probation. And they're brilliant, don't get me wrong, lived experience. I mean, I went to an event recently and they were absolutely inspirational, fantastic. But when I interviewed, I did a piece of work across 4 very differently profiled prisons, one a women's, one a lifers unit in a B it was, I think.
Which is the second most serious level in the British legal system.
Yes, yeah. So, 4 prisons. And the point is that I collated the data together and every single one of them were agreed, look, we get, because as part of the initiative that they're engaging in, because they're sort of pilot sites for a project where they're trying to sort of improve the social climate on a prison wing as a community. And the fact is that every single one of them said, we have people that come in and deliver talks on our course who are lived experience, and they're inspirational. They've got out of prison, they've made, great strides in their life, and they've got their own business, great, but they're not my peer because we're in here and they're not. So I simply thought, actually, we hear very little from prisoners' voices because they're, among the most marginalised. Nobody wants to hear from prisoners. And so I just presented that and kind of said, well, if that's the case, if you take, from, really informed, these are living experience, not lived experience. And they basically argued that no, the people who they're in prison with are their peers, peer mentors. When they leave, they said that would be more helpful. So it's that context and situation is all, isn't it? Because you can have been in prison, you might have been in prison 5-10 years ago, and things are different. There are 130 prisons in the UK. Not every prison is the same. You don't know. It's like your first day at school. You don't know what that bell meant or what that whistle meant or what the day is going to be like. So, yes, that is peer mentoring. So, you've asked me in terms of different initiatives that particularly work in prisons. The point is about having a peer mentor is it's somebody who's much more approachable.
Yeah.
So, who you could literally sit next to or maybe go to the laundry with if you're doing a job. And
a friend.
Yes, that's right. It's equal footing in terms of power, if you like, if you want to talk about it in those senses. But so often somebody can have been in prison for, a couple of months, maybe a year. It can still be a peer mentor to somebody that's just come in, because obviously they could say, that means that, make sure you fill out that form because it means you get this. So that makes people feel much more comfortable and less afraid, like you were saying, about the unknown.
Yeah.
So peer mentoring is used, or peer work, and they're different. Peer support work is different to a peer mentor. I just need to be clear about that. And again, that workshop, the work that I published on, demonstrates that. I won't go into detail about that. But I think the point is that being peer work can operate at very different times during a sentence. So, for example, if you're just over you're working in the induction, the first few days you're in, the mentors or peer support workers are very good because they can show them what it's going to be like so it can manage their expectations, reducing that fear of the unknown. However, when you get to something like you're going to be putting in for parole, leaving early, or maybe how to post a letter or how to make a call to your family, somebody who's been through that or can inform them about the differences of what to expect. So it's at different points during the sentence. And when they're ready to engage, say they want to learn to read, there's a national scheme for Shannon Trust reading mentors. That's been going on for a very long time. Or if they're feeling they've got some sort of self-harm issues or feeling rather down and negative thoughts, then the listener scheme, that's done by prisoners. They get training from Samaritans. So again, that's another sort of peer support. So it's peer mentors, I would say, are quite distinct because they do something slightly different, but there are loads of places where you can actually use, when I say use, I mean in the nicest sense, you can provide very positive identities for people who are in that community now. Because it really annoys me the way that people talk about, prisoners like from a very deficit approach, whereas I'm maybe just hopelessly optimistic, but I always think, oh no, let's start from a strengths-based. Let's look at what strengths they have. Because you think about it, going to a prison, and I remember a group of people I was working with were complaining about the showers not working. And they were grumbling and saying, do you know what? I've got certificates in plumbing all over the place, but they won't let me get in there and fix it. So it's almost like doing a resource mapping, going, well, this guy's an electrician, this guy's a plumber. Do you know what I mean? And you could kind of draw all those positive skills in to benefit the whole community. I'm not naive. You'd have to have all sorts of kind of security checks and, maybe a bit of work there to make sure they're up to speed before you could get them to fix the showers. But, the thought is there, yeah.
Or you're interested in this, why not more? I mean, this is so interesting because I think your parallel with childbirth classes is really, really clear, because if you look at those classes, like anything provided by any network like that, it's about putting together a cohort of peers, right? Like I think you're often put into classes with people who have due dates within the same, 2 weeks of you. But it's also then being led by someone who's been through it themselves. And so you have those mix of experiences, but then, putting people together who are going to have a baby at the same time, giving you those skills, or at least, a little bit more confidence, like how do I soothe this thing when it comes out, and how do I make sure I get it in the car correctly afterwards? Apparently that's a big hurdle. But having that network of people going through it at the same time, often much of what you're missing is just the confidence to know where you are. And I'm wondering, these are really extreme versions of when you need peers, right? So entering prison, having a baby, like both extreme in their own ways. But, some of the problems that I think we're facing today generally in communities, and particularly among, young men in particular, I think who are vulnerable to, who are targeted by extremist groups, it occurs to me that they're often missing that transitional element or appreciation of what that is. I think there's this, as a society, maybe we think you just make friends easily, and we're only just starting to understand that doesn't work that way anymore. And particularly if you leave school, some of your peers will go to university, some won't, some will go into training, but you might not have someone at the same stage as you, and having something in place to help facilitate that. So you're not just left to your own devices looking for peers and then finding them in the wrong places is one way to address that.
Absolutely. I mean, again, I think I texted it to my stepson today. I used to say it takes a village to bring up a child.
Yeah.
Where is that village? Sorry, get all political, but the Thatcher years kind of put an end to kind of a lot of the communities that used to kind of like help bring. That was our version of the kibbutz, the sort of like coal mining communities where each other's kids. But you're absolutely right, relating it to what's happened in modern society. We no longer have an industrial base where young men used to start down the coal pit or in the big factories and the furnaces, and it'd be the older men that'd be clipping them around the ear and saying, "Don't you speak to women like that?" Do you know what I mean? But in terms of making friends and all this kind of social media, that's all before my parenting, thank goodness. Where, how you are received and treated and excluded and bullied, it just scares me to death. Because if you're reading these kind of messages and people are making you feel like you're belonging, it's not rocket science. Of course you're going to go towards it. Whereas if you've got an older brother or somebody in your immediate peer group saying, "Oh, you don't want to read that, listen to that load of rubbish," and it kind of almost kind of keeps you, what's the word, kind of contains you and says, "Oh, that's not worth, oh no, that's not worth giving any credit by," or
it definitely gives you reassurance.
Kind of say, "I'm a bit concerned," and then you end up in the whole prevent kind of arena, which is incredibly difficult to negotiate. And of course, as an academic teaching students, there are parallels to be drawn around the kind of students who I have a duty of care towards, and where I go if I'm particularly concerned. But, and bringing this back, it's not just people who engage in the criminal justice system and get caught up in all these, awful kind of like grooming into terrorist organisations. I see it in my students every day. This, whether it's post-COVID as well, that's bound to have impacted on them. But just talking to each other.
Yeah.
From my research of watching people transitioning in and out of the military, in and out of prison, in and out of the criminal justice system, I just apply that, and I give them something really hard to do in a group of people they've never met before. And do you know what? They make friends because they have to. So it's that thing about socialising them into a kind of environment where they can all dislike me because I'm making them do this really hard thing. Because I'm big enough and ugly enough.
Nothing unites like a common enemy.
Absolutely. Then, and they can hide behind one another because they're groups sort of 5 or 6, and they'll be the one that's a bit more confident.
Which we're going to stress is a good thing. It's a good thing.
Absolutely. So you're not being put on the spot as an individual. Why haven't you done this task? It's kind of the group. And then, and they've just gone through with this hard thing I gave them to do to explain county lines or and AI crime nexus to school kids. And they were brilliant. Honestly, they really stood up to the mark because they were given a responsibility. Because I'm saying to them all, these young
those
kids
are not easy things to explain. Yeah. For our non-UK listeners, county lines are
they're both really complex topics. It took me ages to get my head around, the basics, because it's not my area of expertise. But then, and they've all come away, and their confidence is through the roof, and they feel like they kind of belong much more to the sort of criminological undergraduate community. So a lot of it's not rocket science, unless, like you say, I think you're either born. I've always been chatting, could talk to everyone, but my brother hasn't, and he went off to university, and he came back, and he said to me, he's a year older than I am, how did you do it? And I went, what? And he goes, well, you walk into a room, loads of people you don't know, and just start talking. And I'm going, I'm not sure. But it's not till you meet people like that you suddenly realise just because you find it easy, other people don't. So it's recognising that, society is, everything's so fast paced, and it's difficult, let alone when you start think about getting older, about how difficult it is. We have, you talk about epidemics. Have you seen all the data about the loneliness epidemic that we're going through? People literally.
Yeah.
Well, just on that, I mean, I was wondering if, we're in a podcast ostensibly about the attention economy, although, frankly, that goes into so many different areas of life, I mean, it's mad. But do you think as a result we are, as a society, not paying enough attention to, for example, young men?
Oh.
Well, I was going to say specific subsets of society. So, for example, are we not paying enough attention to young men and what they need, to pick one area that we've spoken about quite a lot recently?
Personally, I absolutely agree. Having brought up 2 boys and a girl, they're in their sort of early 30s now, just starting to have babies and all those like really adult things, which scares me still. But the point is that you're absolutely right. And I struggled with the boys at school because of these kind of attitudes towards this whole gender thing. And it feels like, and I don't know whether you should include this, but it feels like we've gone from men good, girls bad, to boys bad, girls good. Honestly, it's just such a massive shift. And I do worry because, to me, it's not about handing over the kind of like power to another group of people. It's about sharing it equally between us. And I certainly know my lads really struggled. But again, I'm talking about, I'm kind of like in our autumn years, I think it's fair to say. But making new friends for women is hard enough because you haven't got the school gates to chat to all the parents and all this. But then I think about myself and my husband meeting male friends is really difficult. You know, if like going to reading groups or anything like that, or you don't belong to a local church, or we've got some local neighbourhood groups here, so you get to meet people that way. But it also, those infrastructures need to be there. And going back to your point, James, I brought this up. Again, it's a very contentious issue, particularly in academia at the moment. But we've had two major reports that demonstrate that young, white, working class men are less likely to come to university than all the other groups that we traditionally think as being marginalised. So you're absolutely right. What are they doing, James? Because the industry isn't there. You know, if you're not academically gifted, what do? How do you get your sense of status and belonging, and that you're an important person? Do you see, where do you get it from if you can't get it from the work's not there?
I read a really interesting piece maybe a week or so ago, which said that perhaps part of the reason for this is that there is an inbuilt belief that, you know, white young men have had an inbuilt advantage for the last 3,000 years, so why should we worry if they just don't have one at this point? But I do think it's interesting in terms of, you know, just in terms of attention and in terms of the attention that we give on them, because there is no political initiative, is there, really, at the moment to do so, other than, and let's be honest, you know, the kind of reform area, the kind of MAGA area. And that's why they're drawn towards something, because, as Dr. Stephen Heron said on our last episode, you know, that's hope in one form or another for a certain subset of people.
And you're absolutely right, but with respect, I'm going to push you back on you there, James. I mean, think about your history. Have white working class men really had it so good? Okay, but men suffer from the patriarchy. All right, you know, Peterloo massacre. We're talking about British history here, which kids don't get spoken to. You know, you got
which incidentally is slightly different in the US, but yeah, you're completely right. Like the GI Bill changed things in the US, but
at work, I have to keep saying, oh, excuse me, some men. Right, because again, I teach on not so much. No, I am teaching on it next semester. You know, sexual violence, violence against women and girls, and the fact of the matter is, not all men are rapists. Okay, it's such a tiny minority. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to take away from what an awful crime that is. But the thing is that, you know, when you're perpetually kind of given these kind of messages, you have young men that just feel that they don't have a place because they're bad. Who can be bothered? Who can be bothered with it?
Yeah, I think there's something in this. So I'm going to pull it back to the attention economy again, because as you're talking, Catherine, I'm thinking about, wow, you know, 15 years ago when we were looking at things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, those were seen as an entirely different category to media, right? So when the few academic people who talked about the attention economy in those days were really talking about mass media, they were talking about television, newspapers, you know, film, like they were not talking really about social media. And social media was seen to be something different, right? It was seen to be social media.
Yeah.
And I think recently, you know, especially as TikTok has changed and pushed a lot of changes through to other social media, where social media is no longer social, right? It is entertainment, but nothing's filled that gap. You know, in that 15-year period, all of our community social structures, or a lot of them, have changed or gone away. And because there's been this assumption that you could just move that online, or that all happens online and it'll take care of itself. And there's nothing in the meantime that's filled that gap. And even as you're talking, Catherine, you know, a friend of mine said something really insightful a little while ago. You know, we were talking about this issue with, you know, young white working class men. And he said, look, you know, they're not, retail jobs aren't even available to them, right? Like 15, 20 years ago, you could have, you know, you expected, well, if all else fails, at least, you know, I know I can manage a shop, I can manage a Phones for You or McDonald's or a branch of Next or something. And even those jobs have gone away, right? Like they don't exist. So there's nothing filling those gaps. You've lost anything that forms community, right? And gives you a sense of status, and nothing has replaced it, because we've assumed that the existence of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter will replace those social structures, that university is the catch-all social structure for any 18-year-old. And, you know, nothing else fills its place. So if you were made prime minister tomorrow, Catherine, But thinking about it from those terms, right? Like, how do you find peers in these really important transitional moments of your life? What would you restore, or what would you set up from your experience of putting people together into networks effectively?
Well, I think it's that thing about, we talk about globalization and all these things happening way over our heads, but there are winners and there are losers, and sadly they're the traditional ones. And the kind of localized agendas, I think, are even more appealing than they were before. So the fact is, it's about geographic communities, because that way you've got much more of a chance of actually having human interaction. And I kind of do wonder, because unless you keep doing something, so interacting with other human beings, hi, how are you, did your daughter pass the driving test, how's the baby, all those kind of community, down the shop, just popping into the post office, which they're disappearing as well, that whole thing. And the whole sort of British culture based around the pub, that's all changed as well. So it feels like, how many pubs get closed every week now? It's a frightening number, isn't it? But the thing is it's, so where are these community spaces now? Do you know what? I don't know what I do, Claire. I don't know what I would do. I don't want to be Prime Minister, thank you.
I think that's the number one conclusion everyone's saying. Like,
yes,
maybe Keir Starmer does.
Absolutely, yeah. But the thing is, despite the fact that the world has changed, the education sector, the whole employment sector, the community sector, everything's changed. Human beings still have needs, status needs, belonging needs. Now, if we're not going to fill that void, we're all going to end up talking to Stephen Heron every other day of the week, because, where do you get them from? I mean, I suppose it's the same argument about whether you get your belonging and sense of importance from legitimate, less legitimate, or really not legitimate at all sources. So the point is that it's opportunities for everyone to be able to gain some sense of being an important person in the community. That's why these kind of peer mentor roles, big society it used to be called years ago, but the essence is similar. But of course, in order for us to do that, you have to stop putting the priority on paid employment. I don't know, maybe a universal basic income. Okay.
Ooh, radical.
Yeah.
No, that's actually probably not even that radical anymore. We might need to consider it.
It used to be a few years ago. But then, of course, alongside that, you have to have the kind of a whole public sort of NHS medical kind of, you have to have the structures to support that. But the fact is if, for example, if you had a universal basic income, and then you could earn a bit more on top of that if you really want to, but some of us would kind of go, well, actually, I can pay the rent, I can pay the mortgage, and then I can spend my time in the community doing things with and for people. So that's what I've got planned for my retirement. I found loads of places I want to go and volunteer. But of course, until I'm not reliant on that salary so much. So I don't know. It needs exploring. Yeah, it does need exploring.
Sure. And probably not relying on, so what used to be social media to fill the gap of community.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, and we've mentioned it before. I'm very sceptical about where it can possibly all end up.